Greetings, and welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in Ozark history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. The locations and times of day or night that these recorded accounts reach are of interest to us. At the Warren Homestead, some 7 miles east of the tiny logging town of Eminence, local officials in Shannon County made an odd discovery in the fall of 1909 when the leaves in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri turned copper and gold. After the family's frequent visits to the town abruptly stopped, what started out as a standard welfare check eventually turned into one of the most unsettling and poorly understood cases in the history of the area. For nearly 60 years, the information was dispersed among jumbled documents, sealed testimony, and whispered local stories until a group of documents was briefly analyzed by University of Missouri researchers in 1968, after which they were archived and mostly forgotten. After acquiring roughly 80 acres of heavily forested land that abutted what is now the Mark Twain National Forest, the Warren family had relocated to the isolated farm in 1903. Known in Eminence mostly for his infrequent supply runs and his insistence on managing all family business himself, Thomas Warren was a stern-faced guy in his early 42nds with military experience from the Spanish-American War. Following their first year of residency, his wife, Margaret, who was characterized in county records as reticent and particular, was hardly ever seen in town. Although Thomas occasionally suggested distant relatives who could join them eventually, the couple did not have children. Our research team looked at town records and found that the Warrens paid for their land solely with Spanish-origin gold coins. This was a curious detail, but not wholly unusual in an area where financial institutions were still in their infancy. The Garretson family had previously owned the homestead they bought, but they had given it up after a string of crop failures during the 1901-1902 drought years. Although details were never recorded in official documents, local lore said that the Garretsons had also encountered peculiar challenges during their time there. A year-round spring fed a little creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Warren property, which was situated in a narrow valley between two ridgelines. Built into a natural depression in the hillside that local geography would later show to be the collapsed entrance to a tiny cave system, the home itself was situated in an unexpected location midway up the western slope, rather than in the rich bottomland next to the water supply, as logic would have it. Because of its placement, the back wall of the house's cellar was actually the hill's natural limestone. During their first year of living there, Thomas Warren was seen making major alterations to the original building. For the heavier construction, he used local men, but he insisted on doing some things personally, especially the foundation and cellar. One of the workers who helped out for a short time, Jeremiah Dawes, subsequently informed Sheriff McIntyre that Warren had installed a new brick wall to block off a section of the cellar, but he did not provide an explanation for the change. According to Dawes, he worked at night on whatever was behind that wall. We'd arrive in the morning and find fresh mortar and brick dust, though he claimed he'd been sleeping. The Warren case was unique, not because of what the authorities discovered inside the house during that fateful November 1909 visit, but rather because of what they failed to uncover and the property's incomprehensible state. The house was in immaculate condition. It looked as though meals had been made, but not eaten. Personal property was not affected. A series of notebooks written in what one deputy characterized as a language that resembled English but wasn't quite right, and an odd assortment of sealed jars in the root cellar, each painstakingly labeled with dates and odd marks, were the only signs that something was amiss. The Warrens themselves were nowhere to be found. Elijah Cranford, the closest neighbor who lived 3 miles away, gave the most unsettling testimony of all. He claimed that, for weeks after the couple was reported missing, he could hear persons conversing from the direction of the Warren farm. When asked if he had done any research, Cranford firmly replied, "No man with sense walks toward voices with no bodies." Cranford's testimony was first written off as the whims of a reclusive man who enjoyed moonshine, not shouting, he explained in his sworn statement, just talking like people do at supper. But there wasn't nobody there to be doing the talking. Nevertheless, His story was supported by later reports from hunters and trappers who occasionally traveled through the region. In late November 1909, fur trapper Tobias Wheeler, who had a solid reputation for dependability, reported sleeping about a mile from the Warren farm. "I heard them plain as day," he said to the county clerk in a recorded interview from December of that year, a man and woman talking like they were standing just beyond the firelight. "The voices moved when I moved. They stayed the same distance away, no matter which direction I walked. I packed up before dawn and didn't stop until I reached Winona." The Warren homestead gained notoriety in the next years. Despite its rich soil and plentiful water supply, the property did not sell. According to local hunters, game animals appeared to vanish inside a specific radius of the old house, so they avoided the region. The building itself started to deteriorate, though not as quickly as nature should have permitted. "The wood does not rot as expected," wrote William Harkins, the county assessor, in a 1927 report. "It desiccates, becomes dry and hard as stone." Sheriff Josiah McIntyre led the first inquiry in 1909, and in his early report, he described the scene as unnerving in its everydayness. The pantry was stocked, the beds were made, and a partially completed letter that ended in the words, "Margaret believes we finally understood the method by which," was left on Thomas Warren's desk. The rest was never discovered. The state of the mirrors in the Warren house was something that was not included in the official report but was later disclosed in McIntyre's private writings. From the polished metal serving tray in the dining room to the beveled glass mirror in the bedroom, every shiny surface had been carefully covered with cloth. During the inquiry, deputies removed these coverings and found that the same odd geometric pattern that had been seen under the rug had also been scratched on the reflecting rear of the glass mirror. The metal surfaces displayed comparable changes, specific, deliberate changes to the reflecting qualities rather than haphazard scratches. Records of an odd incident that happened just before the Warrens arrived in the Ozarks were discovered by us during our investigation. Thomas Warren had previously served as an acquisition specialist for Thaddeus Blackwood, a Boston private collector. Employment documents from Blackwood's estate show that Warren was sent to several places to collect artifacts of anthropological and historical interest. In 1902, he was sent to the Oklahoma Territory for his last duty before leaving his post, when he was ordered to collect Native American artifacts from the area. Blackwood's obsession with threshold artifacts, or items allegedly able to bridge distinct states of reality, became clearer when his history was further investigated. Items from many indigenous civilizations around the world were part of his collection. They all had geometric themes in common and were connected to regional myths about passages, transitions, or doors. Despite having dubious academic credentials, Blackwood was able to follow his passions without institutional control because of his fortune. He eventually transitioned from a genuine interest in antiquities to a more esoteric and fringe belief system, as evidenced by his interaction with prominent experts of the time. Although Warren's discoveries in Oklahoma Territory were never formally recorded, communication between Warren and Blackwood indicates that there was a substantial controversy regarding one specific item. 3 months later, Thomas and Margaret Warren bought their remote Ozarks property, paying with gold coins. Blackwood's final letter to Warren, dated January 1903, stated, "Your refusal to surrender the artifact constitutes theft. Your claims about its properties are the ravings of an unsound mind. Return what is mine, or face the consequences." In February 1903, Thomas Warren took all of his savings out of a Boston bank, according to financial records our research team found. Although the withdrawal was done in person, Warren's emotional demeanor and request on gold rather than money caused it to be noted as odd in the bank's records. According to the teller's notation, Warren stated that he was leaving on a long trip and that he was afraid of being followed. The Warren disappearance's most concerning feature was the meticulous removal of any evidence of their particular activities from the site. Although personal belongings were still present, Sheriff McIntyre observed that everything that would have revealed their everyday activities or hobbies had been methodically removed. The shelves themselves bore signs of being full, yet there were no books left on them. They had an expensive camera among their belongings, but no photos were discovered. One deputy, James Holbrook, reported discovering a strange design carved into the Warren bedroom's wooden floor, concealed beneath a heavy rug. The root cellar held preserved foods, but also dozens of those odd sealed jars, filled with what the original report described only as unidentifiable organic material suspended in clear fluid. Geometric in nature, with a precision that seemed almost machined rather than hand-carved, he said. Holbrook produced a rough sketch of the pattern in his notes, but the original document was destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1921, leaving only pieces of the picture intact. The center of the design showed significant wear, as though someone had stood in that exact spot repeatedly. The geometric patterns that anthropologists now refer to as entoptic phenomena, which are ubiquitous in the visual hallucinations linked to altered states of consciousness across cultures, are strikingly similar to these fragments when compared to similar designs recorded in Blackwood's collection. Indigenous art linked to shamanic activities that aim to ease transitions between realms or states of being often features these patterns. The thorough documentation of the property's changes over time is what makes the Warren case so strong. Sheriff McIntyre set up a routine of Homestead visits after the initial inquiry, closely monitoring any changes. According to his records, the property was in an unnatural transitional state, with some parts rapidly deteriorating and others remaining completely intact despite exposure to the weather. Most notably, even though the property was purportedly empty, he saw that the geometric design on the bedroom floor seemed to be gradually growing, with new lines emerging in between his visits. 3 years after the disappearance, in 1912, a hunting group reported discovering what they thought were human remains in a tiny cave system that ran through that area of the Ozarks, about a mile from the Warren farm. Authorities discovered that the cave entrance had collapsed when they arrived to conduct an investigation, according to county records. The workers' superstitious anxiety was the official explanation for the abandonment of excavation efforts after they claimed to have heard what they characterized as whispering from inside the rock itself. Later, a local pastor named Reverend Isaiah Thompson received a more thorough description from one of the employees, Samuel Ledbetter. Thompson documented Ledbetter's experience in his own diary, which his descendants have kept. The guy maintains that after they cleared the debris from the cave entrance, they discovered a number of glass jars that resembled those recovered at the Warren location instead of bones as they had anticipated. It looked as though the placement of these jars in a circle had been intentional. Ledbetter asserts that the contents of the jars became agitated and moved within the sealed vessels on their own while the workmen removed the surrounding rock and dirt. The muttering started soon after, although it came from the jars themselves rather than the caves inside, as authorities had been told. When Ledbetter, in a panic, hit one of the jars with his pick, breaking it, the cave collapsed, stopping the excavation. The other employees agreed with his description of the leaked contents, which he described as like smoke, but moving with purpose. However, they agreed to a more straightforward explanation for official records out of fear of mockery or worse. Elizabeth Holloway, Margaret Warren's sister, came from Philadelphia to claim the land in 1910, but she left the area less than a week later. She reportedly told the station master at the Winona Rail Depot, "I would sooner sleep in a charnel house than spend another night in this country," and before departing, she approved the land's immediate sale at a fraction of its value. The property failed to sell and, in 1917, reverted to county ownership because of unpaid taxes. After Elizabeth Holloway's brief vacation to the Ozarks, we discovered letters between her and her lawyer in Philadelphia. In a 1910 letter, she wrote, "I am now convinced that my sister and her husband have met with foul play, though of a nature I cannot explain. The local authorities are either incompetent or complicit. During my stay in that dreadful house, I experienced things that strained credibility. Objects moved without cause, voices carried on still air, and, most disturbing, glimpses of figures in my peripheral vision that vanished when directly observed. In the root cellar, I discovered Margaret's journal hidden behind a loose stone. Its contents so disturbed me that I destroyed it immediately. I will not repeat what she described, but I will say that if even half of it represented reality rather than madness, Thomas brought something back from his travels that should have remained buried. Sell the property for whatever it will fetch. I want no part of it, or anything it contains. An intriguing side note to this case surfaced in 1935 when Dr. Robert Keller, an anthropologist at the University of Arkansas, wrote a brief scholarly article about indigenous beliefs in the larger Ozark region. In it, he briefly mentioned a set of sealed containers found in Missouri's Shannon County that included materials similar to those used in several Native American cleansing practices. According to Keller, such objects were usually buried near the borders of tribal areas and were traditionally employed to capture evil energies. According to his paper, the jars discovered in the Warren cellar may be an unsuccessful attempt to implement these procedures. His colleagues didn't like the study, and it was never officially published. Shortly after, Dr. Keller took a leave of absence and never returned to teaching. Prior to his academic career, Keller served as a missionary among many Native groups in Oklahoma Territory from 1900 to 1905, which may have coincided with Thomas Warren's stay there. According to our study, fragments of notes about what Keller called threshold entities, creatures that allegedly resided at the borders between various states of reality, are included in his personal files, which were given to the University Archive following his death in 1942. He said that although they are essentially neutral, their disregard for human life makes them hazardous. According to Keller's comments, some indigenous customs were created to set and uphold limits against these creatures rather than to communicate with them. Among Keller's most important documents was a sealed envelope with a single photograph, simply titled Warren Specimen 1910. The photograph depicts one of the jars found in the Warren cellar, its contents plainly visible as a hazy material with distinct, ordered structures floating inside. This is not preserved tissue. This is not a plant. This is not a fungus. I believe this is a fragment, is written in hand on the back. At least 7 people or families tried to inhabit the former Warren property between 1909 and 1945. None persisted for more than 4 months. Reasons for leaving ranged from strange noises to recurring sensations of being watched, to more mundane justifications like bad soil or an awkward position. A recurring theme in their testimonies is a depiction of growing uneasiness or discomfort, which many ascribe to the property's remote location. The most thorough description of their experience came from the Miller family, who made an attempt to settle in 1922. Unaware of the property's past, Jackson Miller, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 grown brothers bought it with the goal of starting a modest tobacco farm. In a matter of weeks, Eleanor started to complain of sleeplessness brought on by what she called conversations in the walls. Jackson initially brushed off her worries, but later shared similar experiences. Their description of often entering places without recalling having done so was the most concerning. This was especially true of the bedroom where the geometric pattern had been found. The Millers left the property in July 1922, leaving most of their belongings behind. Jackson wrote in a June 1922 letter to his sister in Street, "Louis, there is something fundamentally wrong with the angles in this house. I know how that sounds, but I can find no better way to express it. Rooms seem larger or smaller depending on where one stands. Doorways don't quite lead where they should. Ella Lanar insists that the hallway to the bedroom grows longer each night. Yesterday I measured it carefully, 16 feet, 7 inches. This morning, the same careful measurement showed 17 feet, 3 inches. Either we are suffering some shared delusion, or this house defies the basic principles of physical space. We have seen them, the previous occupants. They stand in corners, in doorways, always at the periphery of vision. When directly observed, they seem to fold somehow, not vanishing, but receding into spaces that shouldn't exist, according to Jackson's last letter to his sister, which was never published before and found during our research. They are trying to show us something, a method, a process. Eleanor believes they want us to follow them. We are leaving at first light. Whatever the Warrens discovered, whatever transformed them, we want no part of it. Burn this letter after reading." In the summer of 1945, the Peterson family made their final try at residency. unaware of its past. Harold Peterson, his wife Ruth, and Ruth's aging father bought the property at auction. Within weeks, Harold recounted waking up to discover his father-in-law standing still in room corners at night, despite the fact that the elderly man had no history of dementia or sleepwalking. Ruth also started to complain about someone moving things when we're not looking. Harold Peterson came to eminence by himself in September of that year, looking confused and unable to give a clear explanation of the whereabouts of his relatives. Authorities discovered the homestead deserted when they returned with him. They never found Ruth or her father. Due to a lack of proof, Harold Peterson was freed after being detained for a short time on suspicion of foul play. The following year, Peterson was committed to the state hospital in Farmington, where records show he refused to sleep in a room with closed doors until his death in 1957. Prior to leaving the area, he made a statement to local newspaper editor Franklin Mosley that was never printed but was saved in Mosley's personal papers. They're still there, in the house. Not Ruth and her father, the others. The Warrens. I heard them talking through the walls. They found a way to step sideways somehow. They're watching from somewhere, just next to where we are. Through a Freedom of Information request, our team was able to access medical documents from Peterson's stay at the state hospital, which show that he suffered from acute spatial disorientation rather than delusions. The patient's primary care physician, Dr. Emerson Clark, observed, "The patient consistently shows confusion about the physical relationships between objects and spaces. He insists on always keeping visual contact with doorways and becomes very agitated when his view is obstructed. Most notably, he exhibits an unusual form of propagnosia, the inability to recognize faces, but in a very specific manner. Recognizing people perfectly well from the front, but becoming terrified when viewing the same people in profile, insisting they are someone else looking through from the other side, despite intense therapy and medication." After that, county officials condemned the property and let it naturally degrade. The Warren homestead was unaffected by the 1962 forest fire that ravaged parts of Shannon County, but strangely recirculated around it, scorching the surrounding woodlands. Despite the fact that the day's weather data show consistent winds coming from the southwest, local fire officials blamed this on a shift in wind direction. The Warren property is surrounded by a perfect circle of unburned woodland, almost half a mile in circumference, according to aerial photos acquired during the fire management efforts. Our team contacted with fire experts, but they were unable to provide a conventional explanation for this pattern, especially considering the forest's continuous fuel load and the wind conditions that were documented throughout the occurrence. Although soil samples collected in 1968 revealed no discernible variation from the surrounding area, one expert hypothesized that a feature of the soil may have raised the moisture content of the local plants, making it more resistant to burning. In 1968, a group of scholars from the University of Missouri, under the direction of Dr. Caroline Shepard, began a study to record ancient homesteads in the Ozarks, which was the most important step in comprehending the Warren case. Dr. Shepard was interested by the peculiar nature of the case after looking through county records pertaining to the Warren property and was granted permission to visit the location. Respected anthropologist Dr. Shepard, who was especially interested in folk beliefs and customs, put up a team consisting of 2 graduate students, a photographer, and a local guide who knew the area well. Their trip was scheduled to include a 3-day site inspection and thorough documenting of any surviving buildings and artifacts. According to university records, they left Columbia on the 3rd of October 1968, prepared for their planned research. Her team's findings have never been made public. Despite being abandoned for almost 60 years, parts of the building were still standing and the root cellar was mostly intact, according to their preliminary assessment, which was submitted to the university on the 9th of October 1968. Fragments of the journals cited in the initial 1909 investigation were among the objects found. The writing, according to Dr. Shepard, was in fact in English, but it was written in an odd reverse form that needed to be read with a mirror. The report contains transcriptions of several journal fragments, including one particularly unsettling entry attributed to Margaret Warren in August 1908. Thomas insists the process is controllable, that with sufficient preparation we can step through and return safely. I remain unconvinced. What we have glimpsed watching us through the mirrors seems neither malevolent nor benevolent, merely curious in a way that makes me deeply uneasy. The jars continue to fill, though I cannot say how. We sealed the last one this morning, 15 now in total. Thomas says we need at least 24 to complete the circle. I have begun to dream of spaces between spaces. Most importantly, the crew found a small metal box of peculiar composition in a concealed chamber beneath the floor of what had been the Warren bedroom. The box contained a single object, a cylindrical, smooth stone object about 6 inches long, covered in markings that Dr. Shepard tentatively determined might be connected to some Siouan linguistic groups. The item would be taken to university facilities for additional examination, according to the article. The report also described a strange occurrence that the team encountered while there. Although no one was there when the investigation was conducted, all 5 members claimed to have heard what sounded like conversations emanating from the house's ruins on their second night there. The most unsettling was Dr. Shepard's report of discovering one of her graduate students, Michael Collins, standing still in the remains of the Warren bedroom at around 3:30 a.m., facing the corner where the geometric pattern had been recorded. The team's photographer, David Kellerman, reported that his equipment malfunctioned in certain areas of the property, film exposures showing inexplicable distortions, audio recordings containing sections of silence punctuated by what he described as whispering too faint to decipher. Do you see how the angle opens if you look at it correctly? Collins reportedly asked Dr. Shepard when he was approached, but he had no memory of the incident the next morning. Dr. Shepard asked the institution for an immediate leave of absence 3 weeks after submitting this report. She never returned to her job, but the materials belonging to her team were put in storage until she did. Officials from the institution tried but failed to find her. During a regular audit in 1969, the stone object and other antiquities found on the Warren property were reported missing, despite being mentioned in the university's inventory. The investigation was essentially put on hold, and the remaining records were archived. Michael Collins, a retired English professor currently residing in Portland, Oregon, was found by our research team. Despite the passing of decades, his memory of the mission was still clear. In an interview that was recorded, he said, "We should never have stayed overnight." Collins became visibly uncomfortable when questioned about the incident, Dr. Shepard described. The place had a wrongness to it that's difficult to articulate. Distances seemed inconsistent. Sounds didn't travel normally, and there was a persistent sense of being observed from just outside your field of vision. I have no memory of standing in that room. What I do remember is the dreams that started that night. Dreams of a place that was almost, but not quite, the clearing where we were camped. In this place, everything was slightly wrong. Trees bent at impossible angles, colors that had no names, and there were figures there, watching. They looked human until they turned sideways. Then, they weren't. Collins confirmed that the group had in fact discovered the stone artifact mentioned in the report. The last time I saw her, she showed me her composite drawing, a geometric structure that seemed to fold in on itself impossibly. It was warm to the touch, he recalled, even though it had been buried in cold earth for who knows how long. And the markings? They seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles, revealing new patterns. Dr. Shepard became obsessed with it immediately, staying up late, drawing it from various perspectives, claiming that the full pattern could only be understood when all possible views were compiled. She said it was some kind of map, but I couldn't tell. This part of the story has an interesting postscript. In December 1968, a university librarian noted that she had received a package from Dr. Shepard that contained only a handwritten note that said, "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. The Warrens understood too late." I understand now. The note was filed away and forgotten until our research team discovered it while looking through case files. Subsequent research showed that on the 12th of November 1968, Dr. Shepard's car was found abandoned on Forest Service Road 317, about 4 miles from the Warren Homestead location. Several notebooks that contained her study on the Warren case were among her personal belongings that were still at her university office. These journals, which had never been thoroughly studied, included intricate illustrations of the geometric patterns discovered at the Warren homestead, as well as comparable patterns recorded by other indigenous societies around the world. These comparisons had been heavily annotated by Dr. Shepard, who developed what seemed to be a theoretical framework for interpreting them as maps of ways to transition between various states of space or representations of non-Euclidean spatial relationships. Her last notebook entry, dated November 10, 1968, reads, "The Warrens were attempting to create a controlled gateway, using the object as a key and the pattern as a lock. The jars contained fragments of the boundary itself, pieces of the membrane between here and elsewhere, harvested through the initial partial openings they achieved." Thomas believed that with a sufficient quantity of this substance, properly arranged, they could stabilize a transition point indefinitely. What they failed to understand was that the boundary, once breached, begins to erode naturally. They didn't need to complete their ritual, they only needed to wait. Over the ensuing decades, local interest in the Warren homestead diminished. The precise position of the homestead was mainly lost as natural reclamation advanced, and the land finally became a part of the enlarged Mark Twain National Forest in the 1970 seconds. Period Forest Service maps indicate the approximate location, with the straightforward remark, "Historic site, no access." Although infrequently recorded formally, occasional accounts of strange encounters in that area of forest persisted. A party of hikers in 1983 claimed to have lost their way in an area that roughly corresponded to the Warren property's location. Despite being skilled hikers with the right maps and compasses, they were unable to navigate efficiently and ended up returning to the same clearing over and over again after hours of walking. Apparently man-made but of unknown date, a group member reported discovering a set of stone steps that led into the hillside. The group couldn't find it again when they tried to go back to this location. Eventually, they followed a stream and emerged from the forest over 7 miles from where they had planned to leave. Following a normal patrol in the area in 1997, Robert Martinez, a Forest Service ranger, reported an unexpected encounter. Martinez said that in a tiny clearing, he discovered a circle of glass jars. The jars were in perfect condition and looked to be from an old manufacturer. The clearing was nowhere to be found when Martinez and a co-worker arrived the next day. No official inquiry was carried out, and the occurrence was ascribed to navigation mistake. We discovered a descendant of Sheriff McIntyre during our study who had acquired a collection of his great-grandfather's personal belongings, including a journal that was kept apart from official documents. In an entry dated December 1909, McIntyre wrote, "I returned to the Warren place when duty permits. Something about the quality of silence there disturbs me deeply, yet I find myself drawn back. Yesterday, I would swear I heard a woman humming a tune from within the empty house. When I entered to investigate, the sound moved to the yard behind me. When I returned outside, it seemed to come from inside once more. I have told no one. They would think me unfit for office." A later entry from April 1910 is more troubling. "Found another of those damnable jars, this one hidden in the well. The contents were still preserved, still moving slightly when agitated. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The odor was not unpleasant, reminiscent of honey and copper. I have been dreaming of the Warrens since. In these dreams, they stand just behind me, speaking urgently, but I cannot turn quickly enough to see them. They insist they are trying to warn me about something they call the thinning between." McIntyre's final entry regarding the Warren case, dated July 1910, reads simply, "I will not return to that place again. What watches from the windows is no longer even pretending to be human." The journal continues with mundane accounts of county business for several months, with no further mention of the Warren case, until a curious entry from November 1912, "Margaret Warren came into town today. I saw her clearly, standing outside the general store, wearing the same blue dress she wore the last time I saw her in 1909. When I approached, she smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and turned away. I followed her around the corner of the building, but she was gone. No one else reported seeing her. I must accept the possibility that the strain of office is affecting my reason. A final reference appears in an entry from February 1915, shortly before McIntyre's retirement. Thomas Warren stood at the end of my bed last night. I was fully awake, had risen to get a glass of water. He looked as he always did, proper and stern, but his eyes were wrong somehow, too deep, as though looking at him was like looking down a well. He spoke a single sentence. "The circle is almost complete." I did not respond. When I blinked, he was gone. I am now convinced that whatever happened to the Warrens has happened to me as well, though in lesser degree. I find myself wondering if I've been carrying something back from that property all these years, some fragment of whatever they discovered, clinging to me like dust. The fact that the Warren disappearance appears to have been completely forgotten is arguably its most unsettling feature. The case was never covered by any national press, despite the peculiar circumstances. Except for Margaret's sister, no family members ever stepped forward. Oddly, there are no employment records for Thomas Warren before he worked for Blackwood. It seemed as though the couple's existence was limited to their Ozark days, with no past or future. While researching their history, we came upon an odd hole in Boston's public documents. From 1897 until 1902, Thomas Warren is identified as an antiquities procurement specialist with a Back Bay address in city directories. There are no records of him in the city prior to 1897. Before her marriage in 1896, Margaret Warren, née Holloway, is listed in Philadelphia's social registers. After that, she vanishes entirely. The actual marriage is recorded in a church register in Baltimore, Maryland, a city that neither family seemed to be associated with. Thomas Warren's military service is included in this pattern of inconsistent documentation. Our study was unable to locate any military records that would have fit his name and age range, despite the fact that he claimed to have served in the Spanish-American War. And local reporting and eminence accepted this as fact. Likewise, his work with Thaddeus Blackwood is verified solely by Blackwood's personal documents, not by any normally available tax or business registration data. Even before they physically vanished from the Ozarks, it seems as though the Warrens were methodically removing themselves from official existence. What's more unsettling is that it seems as though their existence was in some way ad hoc or transitory, never fully rooted in the standard frameworks of society and documentation. One last paper that we found during our investigation could provide insight into the circumstances surrounding the Warren homestead. A letter from an Osage Nation tribal elder to a federal Indian Agency representative, dated 1902, the same year. Thomas Warren visited the area on Blackwood's behalf, was discovered in the Oklahoma Historical Society's records. A white guy asking questions about the speaking stones of the thin places is warned of in the letter, which also conveys serious fear that the man may find such an item. The letter continues by describing the nature of the thin places in terms that were strikingly consistent with both the Warren Journal fragments and Dr. Shepard's later theoretical framework. These objects were buried by our ancestors for good reason. They are not tools, but doors, and what waits on the other side has patience beyond human understanding. If this man finds what he seeks, he must be made to understand. Such a thing can never be owned. It can only be survived. They are found in places where the natural border between our world and the neighboring one becomes less distinct. It is unclear whether Thomas Warren discovered such an artifact, or whether it had anything to do with the odd happenings at the homestead and the couple's eventual disappearance. Our ancestors recognized these locations by the behavior of animals, which would not enter them, and by the strange quality of silence that prevailed there. They marked such places with stones carved with specific patterns, not to help others find them, but to warn them away. The stones themselves absorbed something of the thinness over time, becoming conduits. We are positive that something strange happened in that isolated area of the Ozarks, something that has defied easy explanation for more than 50 years. Clara Jenkins, who had been a small girl in eminence when the Warren disappearance occurred, spoke to a local historical group in 1965, just before she passed away. She seemed visibly upset when questioned about the matter. The trouble with the Warrens, she said, wasn't that they disappeared. The trouble was that they didn't stay disappeared. For years afterward, People would see them at a distance, standing at the edge of their property, or glimpsed through the trees, always watching, never speaking. My father saw Thomas Warren in town one night in 1915, standing under the lamppost outside the general store. He said he called out to him, but Warren just smiled in a way that made my father's blood run cold, then turned and walked away. When my father followed, there was no one there. Jenkins went on to describe a childhood experience that had never been formally documented. In the summer of 1912, my friend Mary and I were picking blackberries near the old logging road that ran about a mile from the Warren place. We came across a woman sitting on a fallen log, wearing an old-fashioned blue dress. She was humming to herself and seemed to be writing in a small book. We thought nothing of it until she looked up at us. Her face? It wasn't right. It was like looking at a reflection in troubled water, almost but not quite as it should be. She smiled and asked if we would like to see the other side of the hill. Something in her voice made us both turn and run. Later, when I described the woman to my mother, she turned white as a sheet and forbade me from ever going near that part of the woods again. It wasn't until years later that I saw a photograph of Margaret Warren and recognized her as the woman we'd encountered 3 years after she had supposedly vanished. Jenkins' account is corroborated by a letter from Mary Hollister, née Branson, her childhood friend, discovered in the Historical Society's archives. Written in 1,967 inches, response to Jenkins's interview, Hollister confirmed the incident, but added a detail that Jenkins apparently left out. What Clara didn't mention was what happened as we ran away. I looked back once and saw the woman standing, not sitting as she had been, watching us leave. As I watched, she turned sideways, and this sounds insane, but she seemed to become impossibly thin, like a piece of paper seen on edge, and then she was simply gone. I've told no one but my husband about this in all these years. Even now, I can't think about it without feeling that same terror I felt as a child. Today, it is impossible to tell the Warren Homestead site apart from the nearby woodland. Few people know the exact position of the structure, and none can be seen anymore. Although no odd events are reported by the forest rangers assigned to the region, a few of them have observed that the animals in that specific area of the forest appears to be exceptionally rare. In 2001, soil and water tests were conducted in the area of the former Warren farm as part of a geological survey of Shannon County. Despite not being extensively reported, the results revealed a number of irregularities. Unusual amounts of rare earth metals and trace elements not normally present in the area's groundwater were present in the water from the spring that had supplied the Warren homestead. What's more, magnetic resonance imaging of the hillside, where the house had been partially constructed, showed what the report called structural inconsistencies, basically, gaps in the limestone that did not register correctly on the equipment, giving the impression that something indefinable in between solid and void was present. Using GPS information and old maps, we tried to find the precise location while creating this account. Our equipment had mysterious malfunctions on the second day of our hunt. The trees grow too close together here, he explained, pointing to the seemingly normal forest around us. And haven't you noticed? No birds, no insects, nothing makes a sound here but us. Our guide, a lifelong resident of Shannon County, refused to let us continue using traditional compass navigation, stating that we had already crossed into what the locals still hushedly call Warren ground. He was correct. All around us, the forest's natural choir had ceased to sing. We decided to go back and note the spot for possible further research. When we looked back on our day's photos that evening, we noticed that some of the photos shot in that region had odd distortions. These weren't lens flares or equipment issues, but rather what seemed like extended shadows hanging at the edge of multiple frames without any obvious cause. Specifically, one photograph, shot close to what we thought might be the Warren Homestead Foundation's remnants, featured a partial figure at its edge, a woman's hand, and the fold of what appeared to be a blue garment peeking out from behind a tree. At increased magnification, the hand looked somewhat warped, as if it had been captured on camera, moving or passing over water. At the time, none of our team members remembered seeing anyone in the vicinity. We contacted Dr. Eleanor Voss, a Princeton University theoretical physicist whose recent work deals with the idea of brain theory, the notion that our universe might be one of many existing in parallel, possibly separated by only slight differences in fundamental physical properties. In a last attempt to comprehend the Warren case, we gave Dr. Voss access to the historical records, including Dr. Shepard's remarks on non-Euclidean spatial transitions, but we did not explain where they came from. Dr. Voss's response was unexpectedly candid. These equations are remarkably sophisticated for what appears to be work from the late 1960 seconds. The underlying theory anticipates several concepts that wouldn't be formally proposed in physics literature until decades later. If I were to interpret this model literally, it suggests a method for creating a controlled intersection between different states of space-time, essentially a doorway. However, the mathematics also indicate such a transition would be fundamentally unstable, creating a progressive weakening of the boundary in both directions. Whatever your anonymous researcher was investigating, I would strongly advise caution. In theoretical terms, this describes not just a door, but one that cannot be closed once opened, and would continue to open wider over time. When we revealed the source of the equations, Dr. Voss declined further comment, except to say that she found it disturbing that someone with no apparent formal training in higher physics could have developed such a model independently, particularly given the era. She suggested that either Dr. Shepard had collaborated with an unknown mathematician or physicist, or she had somehow derived these concepts through some other method entirely. Ultimately, it is still unclear what became to Thomas and Margaret Warren. Did they run away, abandoning the odd sealed jars and their belongings? Even though there was no indication of violence, were they the victims of foul play? Or, according to local folklore, did they discover anything in that isolated Ozarks region, possibly a relic from Thomas's last expedition, that changed their perception of reality itself? Despite its fragmentation and incompleteness, the evidence points to a story that is more unsettling than any traditional explanation. According to their careful documentation, the sealed jars containing fragments of the boundary and the geometric patterns carved into various surfaces, the Warrens seem to have discovered or invented a way of moving between different states of reality, what Thomas Warren referred to as the thinning between, and what contemporary physics might call a interbrain connection. Permitting limited interaction between our reality and somewhere else is suggested by the subsequent manifestations, the Warrens' appearances years after their disappearance, the spatial anomalies experienced by later occupants of the property, and the enduring sense of being watched from just outside normal perception. The idea that this gateway was not only continuous, but also grew with time is the most unsettling, as Dr. Voss's reading of Shepard's equations would have predicted. The trend from fleeting glimpses and half-heard voices in the early testimonies to more substantive manifestations in later years shows a steady strengthening of the connection. If this model is accurate, the line separating our world from whatever is outside of the thinning is getting fuzzier, with that solitary Ozark forest area at its core. The personal notebook of Dr. Caroline Shepard, which was found in her abandoned University of Missouri office, has the last recorded mention of the Warrens. I hear the Warrens at night now, whispering just behind me. They've been trying to get back for 60 years. They say I can help them. They say it's too late to close what they opened, but perhaps not too late to cross over ourselves. Tomorrow, I go back to the Homestead one last time. May God forgive what I'm about to do. The last entry, dated the 10th of November 1968, states, I understand now why the jars were sealed. They were trying to contain it, piece by piece, but some things cannot be contained once recognized. Dr. Shepard's car was discovered abandoned on a Forest Service road about 4 miles from the Warren homestead's presumed location. She has never been seen again. The Warren case has become a local legend, a ghost story recounted around campfires, and a whispered warning to stay away from specific areas of the woodland after dark in the decades since Dr. Shepard vanished. Mainstream research has not looked into the scientific ramifications of what they might have found, nor have they looked into the relationships between their work and contemporary theoretical physics. However, the trend persists. According to Shannon County records, there have been at least 7 mysterious disappearances within 5 miles of the Warren property's suspected location between 1968 and the present. Extensive searches were unsuccessful in both cases. Personal items were discovered in 3 cases in a clean and orderly manner, as if the missing persons had just left for a short time and never came back. In the late evening light, locals continued to report seeing a well-dressed couple strolling along the edge of the forest. A man with a stern countenance and a woman in blue, who were briefly visible before disappearing. Some people report seeing lights among the trees where no buildings are present, or hearing far-off conversations carried on the wind from uninhabited areas of the forest. The physical remnants of the Warren homestead have been reclaimed by the forest, but their presence is still felt. If the fragmented records and testimonies are to be believed, the portal they created and the border they over are still open to anyone who knows how to find it, or perhaps more unsettlingly, to anyone it chooses to expose itself to. It might be wise to keep some mysteries unsolved. It's possible that some doors can never be fully closed once they've been opened. The Warren family's experience serves as a sobering reminder that the boundaries we take for granted may be more brittle than we would like to think. In the isolated areas of the earth, where isolation fosters its own reality and quiet, rules, and pay close attention to the quiet that surrounds you if you ever find yourself in Shannon County's eastern regions, where the valleys are deep and the forests are thick. According to the locals, the Warrens are still there, watching from somewhere close to our world, just out of sight, waiting for someone else to comprehend what they saw and, maybe an understanding, join them on the other side of the thinning. In what may have been the area around the Warren property, a hiker reported discovering an old glass jar at the base of a tree in the spring of 2023. There was what looked like murky water in the wax-sealed jar. The hiker reported hearing murmurs coming from the jar itself before officials could recover it. They left it where they found it and fled the scene, terrified. The jar was gone by the next day when a forest warden looked into it. While examining the area, the ranger said that he briefly saw what appeared to be a woman dressed in antiquated garb standing among distant trees, observing him. She turned sideways and disappeared when he called out to her. A trick of light through the forest canopy was the reason given by the ranger for the sighting. Unusual silence in the area. No wildlife observed or heard. Recommend routine monitoring, but no cause for concern, he said in his official report. Nonetheless, which was an odd observation. One of many mysteries lost to time in the far reaches of the American wilderness is the Warren case, which is still officially unresolved. Even so, residents still avoid some spots in those heavily wooded hills where cell phone connections wane and GPS coordinates occasionally deviate from one another. They don't require scientific explanations of membranes between realities or brains. The Warrens, wherever and whatever they have become, are still observing from just outside the border of perception, and they simply know that some areas belong more to the other side than to this one. The lines might not be as clear-cut as we believe.